I mentioned last night how a lot of individuals online are coping and seething about the success of Pokemon Legends ZA and honestly the success of the Pokemon brand as a whole. A lot of these people are acknowledging now that Generation 8 and 9 now have a lot of dedicated fans, and there is no denying that Pokemon Legends Arceus is considered one of the all-time great Pokemon games. And so people are bending over backwards trying to find something to complain about. They're complaining about fans, complaining about Game Freak, they're complaining about the Pokemon Company, they're complaining about Nintendo, and yet they just can't bring themselves to acknowledge that Pokemon, in a lot of ways, is more popular than ever. The people who are playing about Pokemon do not play these games. And as a result of that, their criticisms of them, their observations, their bitching, their complaining, like they don't really amount to much. This is the end result of all those memes about Scarlet and Violet being completely unplayable and glitchy is that they aren't actually true. People who actually played those games became huge fans of them because they were way better than the other slop that came out that year. Like Scarlet and Violet were way better than something like, say, Elden Ring, than Starfield, than Hi-Fi Rush. And it's not something that like the community acknowledged at the time because Pokemon is one of those IPs that desperately need to be downplayed no matter what. But over time, as people played those games and experienced them, they became unbelievably popular. And honestly, I myself have come out and said that Scarlet and Violet is, at this point, on the upper echelon of Pokemon generations. Now, it's not my all time favorite, but at the same time, the new formula, the quest system, and just the general structure is something that really should have been celebrated. But at the same time, you still see a lot of plebs, a lot of YouTubers complaining about sword and shield structure. Like, oh, it's all just straight lines. Completely disregarding the fact that Scarlet and Violet completely corrected that problem. It doesn't. Again, this is a really good example as to why I feel as if the criticism towards Pokemon is nothing more than a giant cope. It's been very obvious to me for a long time that Pokemon's primary critics are people who want the games to fail. People who hate the series and hate the fans and hate how popular it is and are doing everything they possibly can to undermine it. Back in the day, there was this mindset that like, oh, it's the kids are just gonna grow out of it. There was even a South Park episode made about it. But over time, the feelings toward the brand have gotten like even more and more and more ridiculous to the point where Pokemon haters have to LARP as like hardcore fans of Generation 1 in order to be taken seriously. And in fact, we're kind of at the point now where guys have to pretend they were huge fans up until Generation 5, which, by the way, was this very poorly received generation when it first came out. Like, it is laughable, honestly, like seeing what Pokemon hate has kind of devolved into. And I've always been a very big critic of the backlash towards Pokemon, but I do think Legends EA is kind of the turning point where these guys like their perpetually online bitching is just so at odds with the reality of the situation that it can no longer be denied because they created an actual real life controversy over Generation 8, over Dexit, over how they handled that situation. And it didn't amount to much. Like, not only did Sword and Shield succeed, it broke records only to be shattered again with Scarlet and Violet. And they branched out into spin off territory with Legends Arceus and now ZA. And now what we're seeing is a lot of people coping and seething about it. They can't admit that Pokemon continues to be successful due to its quality and instead have to like kind of bend over backwards and try and tell people that it's because of the fans like having low standards or like it's only doing well because it's Pokemon and like no real thought or consideration put into the brand because the way people treat these games, it's it's worse than the way they treat known woke products like Ghost of Your Toy or, Baldo. Like it's very noticeable, how people like Smash JT are releasing statements about how Pokemon is compromised and they're pushing DEI and it's completely ruined. And then meanwhile, they'll turn around and shill for something like, you know, Ghost of Your Toy to a certain extent. Like the double standard is very, very noticeable. And I do think it needs to be said that it has no real bearing on the game's quality or success. Like nobody outside of the Pokemon hate community really cares, like we saw this a lot going into it. Actually, this has been happening since Scarlet and Violet came out. You keep seeing people try and hype up competitors. Like I've seen people hype up like slop like Temtem. I've seen them hype up like Power World, and now they're kind of trying to hype up Digimon. As like viable alternatives to Pokemon, which. By the way, is never going to pan out because Pokemon is very, very distinct and has a very different vibe than all those things. But like everybody wants to do this thing where they're sitting there like, oh, Pokemon, Digimon, it's way better. It has way better graphics, and like, but nobody cares about the graphics. It's like they keep doing this thing where they keep like trying to hype up games based on things that nobody actually cares about. Because the reality of the situation is people like what Pokemon does better than its competition. The entire cope that a lot of these people have that Nintendo hates competition and they send their legal teams after the competition. That's just not, it never has been true. Power World got a lawsuit because of its blatant and obvious plagiarism. And this isn't like a subtle thing, this isn't something that people are like no, it's because of plagiarism, and everybody is just kind of like refusing to acknowledge the obvious that Nintendo was in the right to go after them, that they are going to win the lawsuit, and that they aren't particularly um they wouldn't be severely impacted by a competitor. We saw this with Yokai Watch, which was a much more valid competitor to Pokemon back in 2012. Like that had a lot of moderate success at the time, but Nintendo didn't go after them legally. In fact, they promoted the game and wanted it to take off in America. Like the Nintendo of America put a lot of effort into promoting the game over here to try to get it to take off. It was a big product for them. And Yokai Watch had a lot more credibility than Power World did. So, like, this idea that Nintendo hates competition, especially when it theoretically should just release on their own platform to begin with, it's so completely laughable that you can't really take it seriously. It's just a complete cope. The idea that like something like Digimon is going to come out of nowhere and just be bigger than Pokemon is just laughably stupid. Because they had 30 years to build up their brand to get to where they needed to be in order to be competitive, and they just couldn't do it. And honestly, the fact of the matter is, like, when you only talk about Digimon or Shin Megami Tensei or Power World to downplay Pokemon, like you're just creating this culture that like promotes Pokemon as the gold standard when it comes to this genre. Like it isn't going to result in anything truly positive for your brand. And that's kind of my mindset looking at this, like looking at people like coping and seething about Nintendo, coping and seething about the Pokemon company. Like they're just desperate to downplay this specific brand. It has nothing to do with Digimon. It has nothing to do with being fans of other media. It has nothing to do with being like this jaded fan. Like people just want to see Pokemon fail because they're tired of this being like more popular than their favorite thing. And that's kind of my mindset looking at this, like seeing how desperate they are to gaslight people into thinking Pokemon sucks now, but like we're in the early stages, I think, of the narrative falling apart the same way that Gen 1ing fell off. Gen 5 in a lot of way is the new Gen 1 because the people who grew up with that generation are now like using that as the gold standard, like to weaponize against like newer generations. And it's something that really needs to be called out. Something that needs to be said is that the newer Pokemon generations are still high quality, are still innovating, are still doing all this stuff, and in a lot of ways are better than the old games. The idea that Pokemon peaked with like the Gen 4 remakes, I think, is just completely off touch, off base. Like it is the same kind of nonsense as saying as they peaked with Gen 1. And that's something I've been saying for a long time, but it's about high time that we in the Pokemon community start disregarding these individuals because they are bad faith actors. They are going to complain no matter what happens. They will never appreciate Pokemon for what it is. Like they simply want to see this brand fail.